The dust of the road was a bitter taste on Amelia Vance's tongue, a gritty reminder of every cruel word. Theron Croft's final pronouncement echoed in her mind, each syllable a fresh lash against her spirit. "You are a burden," he had spat, his face a mask of grief-soured resentment. "Worthless. A constant reminder of what I've lost. Get out of my sight." The door to the only home she had ever known had slammed shut, the sound as final as a coffin lid. Now, there was only the endless, unforgiving prairie and the setting sun bleeding across the horizon like a fresh wound. In her small satchel, her fingers found the two things she owned in the world, her mother's leather-bound journal, its pages filled with a love she could barely remember, and the small, smooth wooden bird her father had carved for her before he passed. It felt impossibly fragile in her trembling hand, a tiny, flightless thing, much like herself. She had been walking for hours, the town of redemption a hazy promise in the distance. Every step was an argument against Theron's decree. She was not worthless. She was her mother's daughter. She was intelligent, she was capable, but her heart struggled to believe it. Despair was a heavy cloak, and with each mile, it grew heavier, threatening to suffocate the last embers of her hope. The town, when she finally stumbled into it, was little more than a single dusty street lined with weary-looking buildings. It did not feel like a place of redemption. It felt like an end. Amelia's arrival in redemption was met with indifference and suspicion. Her dress was travel-stained, her face smudged with dirt and tears, and her spirit was so thoroughly bruised that it showed in the slump of her shoulders. She approached the mercantile, a sign in the window promising help wanted, but the proprietor, a man with a pinched face and cold eyes, took one look at her and shook his head. "We need someone respectable," he said, the unspoken word but not you hanging in the air between them. A similar rejection met her at the saloon and the livery stable. With each dismissal, Theron's voice grew louder in her head. Worthless. She found herself by the town well, the rough-hewn wood cool against her palms. She sank onto its edge, the satchel falling to the ground beside her. Her throat was tight with unshed tears. The world felt vast and empty, and she was utterly alone within it. She drew out the small wooden bird, its polished surface a stark contrast to her own grimy fingers. It was a relic from a life where she had been cherished, a life where the word home meant safety and love, not a door slammed in her face. She thought of her mother's gentle hands, of the stories she would read from her journal, tales of courage and kindness. Where was that courage now? It felt like a myth, a fairy tale from a forgotten land. A shadow fell over her, and she looked up, expecting another command to move along, another face of judgment. Instead, she saw a woman whose face was lined with the evidence of both hard work and frequent smiles. Her hair was streaked with grey, pulled back in a severe but practical bun, and her hands, though dusted with flour, looked strong and capable. "You look like you've wrestled with the devil and lost 3 falls out of 3, the woman said, her voice a surprising mix of sternness and sympathy. Amelia could only stare, her voice lost in her throat. The woman's gaze was direct, missing nothing of Amelia's exhaustion or the profound sadness in her eyes. "I'm Martha Gable. I run the bakery. And it seems to me a body can't solve their troubles on an empty stomach." Mrs. Gable didn't wait for a response. She simply motioned with her head toward a neat little building from which the warm, inviting scent of baking bread was wafting. "Come along. I've a pot of stew that won't eat itself, and a floor that needs scrubbing. You can earn your supper and a cot for the night." It was not an offer of charity, but a transaction, and for that, Amelia was profoundly grateful. It was an acknowledgement that she could provide something of value, even if it was just the strength of her back. For the first time since that terrible door had slammed shut, a flicker of something other than despair stirred within her. She followed Mrs. Gable into the warm, fragrant haven of the bakery, the scent of yeast and cinnamon a balm to her frayed soul. It was a small kindness, a simple offer, but to Amelia, it felt like being pulled from a churning, icy river onto solid ground. Weeks turned into a month. Amelia found a rhythm in the bakery, a quiet purpose that began to mend the fractured pieces of her self-worth. She rose before the sun, her hands learning the comforting weight of dough, her mind finding solace in the precise measurements of flour and sugar. She swept the floors until they shone, polished the glass of the display cases, and kept Mrs. Gable's accounts with a neat, meticulous hand that surprised and pleased the older woman. Mrs. Gable was a fortress of practical wisdom. She never pried into Amelia's past, but she saw the shadows that still lingered in the young woman's eyes. "A person's worth ain't measured by where they come from, child," she said one afternoon, watching Amelia carefully ice a cake. "It's measured by what they do right here, right now. And you do good work each night, in the small, clean room above the bakery that now felt more like home than her stepfather's house ever had," Amelia would read from her mother's journal. Her mother's words spoke of resilience, of finding beauty in small things, of the unshakable value of a good heart. It was through these nightly communions that Amelia began to rebuild her identity, not as Theron Croft's worthless burden, but as her mother's beloved daughter. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Samuel Blackwood first entered the bakery. He was a rancher, his holdings vast, his reputation sterling. He moved with a quiet confidence that was neither arrogant nor loud. He had come for a loaf of bread, but his eyes, a clear, steady blue, found Amelia as she worked behind the counter. He didn't stare, but his gaze was filled with a gentle curiosity. "Good afternoon, miss," he said, his voice deep and calm. He smiled, and it was a genuine, unassuming thing that reached his eyes. Amelia, startled by the direct and respectful address, could only nod and murmur a reply, her cheeks flushing. He was the first man to look at her and not see a servant or a stray, but simply a person. Samuel Blackwood became a frequent customer. He developed a sudden and insatiable appetite for Mrs. Gable's cinnamon rolls, always arriving in the late afternoon when Amelia was tending the counter. Their conversations were brief, circling around the weather, the quality of the day's baking, the small news of the town. Yet, within these simple exchanges, a deeper connection was being forged. He had a way of looking at her that made her feel seen. He noticed the smudge of flour on her cheek and would mention it with a soft smile, not a smirk. He saw the weariness in her posture after a long day and would ask if she was well. His kindness was a steady, gentle rain on the parched ground of her heart. One afternoon, he lingered after paying for his order. "Mrs. Gable tells me you keep her books," he said, his tone one of genuine interest. "She says you have a remarkable head for figures," and Amelia was taken aback. I do my best, sir." He shook his head slightly. "Please, call me Samuel." He looked at her, his expression earnest. "Intelligence is a fine quality, Miss Vance." A valuable 1 inch. The word valuable struck her. Theron had called her worthless. Mrs. Gable had shown her she had worth in her labor. But Samuel was telling her she had worth in her mind, in who she was. The idea was so foreign, so powerful, that it left her breathless. She began to look forward to his visits, to the sound of the bell above the door announcing his arrival. It was a cautious, fragile hope, a seedling pushing its way through cracked earth. She still wrestled with the old ghosts, the ingrained belief in her own insignificance, but Samuel's quiet, consistent respect was a powerful antidote. The sky, which had been a placid blue for weeks, turned a bruised purple one Tuesday afternoon. The clouds gathered with a menacing speed, and before the town of Redemption could properly batten down its hatches, the heavens opened. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. The dry creek bed that ran along the edge of town swelled into a raging, muddy torrent, and by evening, Main Street was a river. The general store, situated in a low-lying spot, suffered the worst of it. The next morning revealed a scene of devastation. Waterlogged sacks of flour and sugar had burst, creating a pasty, foul-smelling sludge on the floor. Tins of food were rusted, bolts of fabric ruined. The store owner, Mr. Henderson, stood amidst the chaos, his face a portrait of despair. The townsfolk gathered, offering sympathy but little in the way of a solution. It was then that Amelia stepped forward. She had spent the night listening to the storm, her heart aching for the town that had given her refuge. Seeing Mr. Henderson's ruin, she felt not pity, but a surge of purpose. "We must work quickly," she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising everyone, including herself. We can salvage more than you think. Using the accounting skills her mother had taught her and honed by her work for Mrs. Gable, she began to direct the cleanup. She created 3 areas, one for goods that were a total loss, one for items that could be cleaned and sold at a discount, and one for undamaged stock. She organized teams, her quiet authority born not of command, but of clear-headed competence. Samuel Blackwood arrived with several of his ranch hands and watched, amazed, as Amelia brought order to the chaos. She was not just a gentle spirit, she was a leader. He saw her moving through the mess, her brow furrowed in concentration, directing men twice her size with a quiet confidence that earned their immediate respect. By day's end, what had seemed like a total disaster had become a manageable, organized recovery effort. Samuel looked at Amelia, her dress splattered with mud but her eyes bright with accomplishment, and he felt a wave of admiration so profound it nearly staggered him. She was more than just good or intelligent, she was resilient. She was a force. In the days that followed the flood, the way the town saw Amelia Vance transformed. She was no longer just Mrs. Gable's quiet helper, she was the woman who had saved Henderson's store from ruin. But no one's perception shifted more dramatically than Samuel Blackwood's. He saw in her a partner, a woman of substance and strength equal to his own. He began his courtship in earnest, not with flowery words or grand gestures, but with the same quiet sincerity that defined him. He invited her to walk with him in the evenings, their conversations deepening from polite pleasantries to shared hopes and histories. Finally, one Sunday, he arrived at the bakery in his best wagon and asked if he might show her his ranch. As they rode out of town, leaving the dusty street for the open plains, Amelia felt a sense of peace she had never known. The Blackwood Ranch was nestled in a valley, a sprawling testament to hard work and good stewardship. Samuel stopped the wagon on a high ridge that overlooked it all. The green pastures, the sturdy homestead, the cattle grazing peacefully, it was a kingdom built of sweat and determination. "My father built this place from nothing," he said softly, his eyes on the horizon. "He always said the land was the only thing of real worth. That it's all a man can truly own." He turned to her, his gaze intense and full of an emotion that made her heart beat faster. He was wrong. He reached out and took her hand, his touch both gentle and firm. "Amelia, you're worth more than all his land. More than all of this." He paused, his voice thick with feeling. "Your kindness, your strength, your intelligence, that is true wealth. I have never met anyone like you." He took a breath. "Marry me, Amelia. Let me build a home with you. Let me spend my life showing you your own worth. I'll be yours forever." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming, unbelievable joy. For the first time, the echo of Theron's voice was completely silent, replaced by the steady, heartfelt promise of a good man who saw her, truly saw her, for everything she was. A week before the wedding was to take place, a lone rider approached the town of Redemption. He was gaunt and weary, his clothes dusty from a long journey. As he dismounted in front of the bakery, Amelia felt a cold dread wash over her. It was her stepfather, Theron Croft. He looked older, his face etched with lines of regret that hadn't been there before. The bitterness that had once radiated from him was gone, replaced by a hollow, consuming sadness. He saw her standing in the doorway, and his shoulders slumped as if under a great weight. "Amelia," he rasped, his voice cracking. He took a hesitant step forward, stopping when she flinched. "I've been looking for you." After she had gone, he explained, the house had become silent, empty. In his loneliness, he had finally opened her mother's journal, which Amelia had left behind in her haste. He had read the pages, page after page of his late wife's love for her daughter, her pride in Amelia's mind, her gentle spirit. He had seen his own cruelty reflected in his wife's loving words, and the realization had shattered him. "She wrote of your worth on every page," he said, his voice choked with tears that now flowed freely. "Every single page. And I threw you away. I was so lost in my own grief, I couldn't see anything else. I couldn't see you." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I cannot unsay the things I said. I cannot undo the pain I caused. But I am asking, begging, for your forgiveness. I was wrong, Amelia." So terribly wrong. Amelia looked at the broken man before her. The anger and hurt that had been her constant companions for so long began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of pity, and finally, peace. She had found her own worth, not in his approval, but in herself and in the love of Samuel and this town. She could afford to be merciful. "I forgive you, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice soft but sure. And in that moment of forgiveness, the last chain to her painful past finally broke. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The small town church was filled to bursting, the scent of wildflowers mingling with the faint perfume of polished wood. Everyone was there. Mr. Henderson, his store now thriving, beamed from a front pew. Mrs. Gable, dressed in her finest lavender silk, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her face a perfect picture of maternal pride. At the back of the church stood Theron Croft, his posture humbled, his gaze fixed on his stepdaughter with an expression of profound remorse and gratitude. He had asked, hesitantly, if he might have the honor of walking her down the aisle, and Amelia, in her ultimate act of grace, had agreed. As the music began, she took his arm. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, her hair adorned with a few wild daisies. She was not a grand lady or a wealthy heiress, she was Amelia Vance, a woman who had forged her own value from the ashes of rejection. She looked radiant, her happiness an almost tangible light that filled the room. Samuel stood at the altar, his eyes locked on her as she approached. The love and admiration in his gaze was a fortress, a promise of a lifetime of safety and devotion. As Theron placed her hand in Samuel's, he leaned in and whispered, so only she could hear, "He is a good man. You deserve this. You deserve everything." The ceremony was simple, the vows heartfelt and direct. They promised not riches or ease, but partnership, respect, and an enduring love. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, a joyous cheer erupted from the congregation. Samuel leaned down and kissed his bride, a gentle, reverent kiss that sealed their new beginning. Walking out of the church into the warm sunlight, hand in hand with her husband, Amelia felt a sense of homecoming so complete, so absolute, that it brought tears to her eyes. This was her home. These were her people. She was worthy. 5 years later, the Blackwood Ranch was more prosperous than ever, but its greatest treasures were not the cattle or the fertile land. They were the sounds of children's laughter that echoed from the porch of the sturdy homestead. Amelia stood watching her 2 children, a boy with Samuel's steady blue eyes and a little girl with her own determined spirit, as they played in the yard. Samuel came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. The gesture was as familiar and comforting as breathing. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a sense of deep, abiding contentment settling over her. She was no longer the timid, broken girl who had stumbled into redemption. Motherhood, partnership, and the quiet dignity of a life well lived had transformed her. She was a confident and capable woman, managing the ranch's finances with the same sharp mind that had saved the general store, her opinions and insights valued by her husband as much as her love. Theron Croft was a regular, if quiet, visitor. He had sold his old farm and now lived in a small cabin on the far edge of their property. He was a doting, gentle grandfather, his past cruelty redeemed through quiet acts of service and an unwavering, respectful love for the family he had almost lost. He never sought to be the center of their lives, content to be a humble part of the happiness he had once tried to destroy. Amelia reached into the pocket of her apron and her fingers closed around a small, smooth object. She pulled out the little wooden bird. It was no longer a symbol of what she had lost, a desperate anchor to a painful past. Now, as she held it in her palm, its wings poised for flight, it was a reminder of her journey. It represented the fragile hope that had survived the dust and the despair, and the incredible strength she had found within herself to build a new life, a new home, and to finally, truly understand her own profound and immeasurable worth.